Hello, students. I welcome you all to this particular module. And in this module, we are going to have a discussion on Romanticism, its meaning, features, important writers associated with Romanticism, timeline of Romanticism, and most notable works of Romanticism. To begin with, we will have a quick glance over some introductory aspects of Romanticism. Basically, Romanticism was a literary movement. It was not just limited to the field of literature. Romanticism as a movement influenced, had a profound impact on not just the literature but also on the fields like art, architecture, human psychology, human thinking, etc. But our interest would be limited to the impact and the influence of Romanticism onto the field of literature. As I said, it was a literary movement. It began in the late 18th century. Scholars usually are of the opinion that Romanticism, the proclamation, the declaration, the arrival of Romanticism can be explicitly seen with the publication of an anthology, a collection of poems published in the year 1798 with the title Lyrical Ballads. Lyrical Ballads was an anthology which consisted of poems written by William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, two huge champions of Romanticism in England. With the publication of the work Lyrical Ballads, we see the definite arrival of Romanticism in England. But much before the publication of Lyrical Ballads in the year 1798, we find some poets in 18th century, particularly from 1750 onwards, writing poems which were in stark contrast to the kind of poems written by neoclassical poets. And Romanticism ended in England around the middle of the 19th century, but its influence, the spirit of Romanticism, runs through each and every sphere of human activity and in each individual. Romanticism can be seen as a reaction to the huge changes in society that occurred during this period. This period means the period encompassing the early, middle, and later decades of 18th century. British Romanticism is a literary movement that ran from roughly 1790 to 1830, and it is regarded as one of the most potent forces that have shaped the modern world. So potent has Romanticism been since the late 18th century that one author has called it the profoundest cultural transformation in human history since the invention of the city. Now, to trace the etymological or the derivative meaning of the word romantic, it had the connotation of referring to medieval romance and tales of adventure. They were known as romances. Romances meant medieval romance and tales of adventure. Its connotations extend to what is fictitious and fantastic. Now, to look into the causes, the forces, the events, the developments which led to the happening of Romanticism. Some of them are the French and American revolutions, economic and social changes. Particularly these two, influenced a shift away from the fundamental assumptions and concerns of the Enlightenment toward ideas of democracy, individual rights, and a belief in the limitless possibilities inherent in change and progress. Moving on, if we take a look at Romanticism, some of the core elements, some of the central features of Romanticism are an emphasis on emotional and imaginative spontaneity, the importance of self expression and individual feeling, an interest in primitive forms of art, interest in the common man and childhood, a deepened appreciation of the beauties of nature, a general exaltation of emotion over reason, and of the senses over intellect. Now, let us try to understand a little more detailed manner. An emphasis on emotional and imaginative spontaneity. Imagination and emphasis on emotions are the two pillars of romantic literature, of romanticism. Now, what do we mean by that? The writers associated with romanticism, they believed in the primacy of emotion and imagination of human beings. It doesn't mean that the writers of the earlier period, neoclassicism or classicism, they didn't believe in these things, but they tended to look down upon the role and effect of emotion and imagination on the human mind, human psyche. The writers of neoclassicism, they thought that the emotion and imagination will have corrupting influence on the human mind, particularly of common man's psyche. Whereas the romantic writers, they thought that emotion and imagination are very much necessary, they contain truths. Whatever we believe in passionately, that must contain grain of truth. And we should be imaginative. We should believe in imagination, in the imaginating capacity of the human mind. So, whereas neoclassical writers, they gave more importance to reason, intellect, and practical thinking of the men, the Romantic period writers, they placed greater weightage upon the emotion and imaginative spontaneity. Next, the importance of self expression and individual feeling. Now, what do we mean by that? In the earlier periods, in classical literature, classicism doesn't give importance to, it doesn't place any value upon individual self expression. Classic literature doesn't have any place for the emotions and imagination of an individual human being and the individual feelings, self expression. Whatever a person feels, whatever an individual thinks, whatever thoughts are entertained by individual people are not important. Neoclassicism or classicism, they give importance to mass. They give importance. They say it is not the individual but the society as a whole which is which really matters and which is of greater importance. So the feelings of the individual people do not have any place in neoclassical or classical literature. Whereas when we come to romantic period literature, romanticism is all about the individual expression, the self expression, the thoughts that come to one's mind, the feelings that arise in one's heart, the emotions which erupt in the human heart that are important, not what the society thinks, what is good for the society, and all that. The poems of William Wordsworth, S.T. Coleridge, Byron, John Keats, P.B. Shelley, all these, when we go through them, they make it very clear they are the expression of the individual souls, but they are not the voices of the society or the country. The next point that we are going to discuss is an interest in primitive forms of art. It is a unique feature of Romanticism that many of the prominent poets and writers of Romanticism, they made primitive forms of art once again popular. The primitive forms of art like ballads and many other such forms of art, they regained the earlier popularity. They caught the fancy of the people of the period because romanticism brought back romanticism. They made frequent use of primitive forms of art. like ballad and odes, etc. We can give the example of the odes written by P.B. Shelley, and even John Keats also wrote some of them as examples. Next point that we are going to discuss is a very interesting feature of Romanticism, that is interest in the common man and childhood. Interest in the common man and childhood. What do I mean by that? See, Romanticism, as against classicism, believed in, we have come to know about this one, they believed in individuality, individual expression, self expression, and all that. Along with that, it is not just any individual, but Romanticism gave importance to expressing the feelings of common man on the ground, the rustic people, the individuals living in the countryside. Romanticism took deep and great interest in giving voice to the thoughts and feelings and emotions of the common man, and not only common man but also the childhood. Childhood and the feelings of the children have found a special place in Romanticism. Many of the poems written by Wordsworth, they contain children as the protagonist, children as the main speakers of the poem. Wordsworth said, child is the father of man. That goes on to illustrate the kind of interest which Romanticism had in childhood. And the common man. Say, classicism, in classic literature, in the classicism movement, common men do not find any place for them. It is the royal, it is the aristocratic, it is the nobility which rules the roost in classical literature. But when we come to Romanticism, who have gained prominence, it is the common man and the children. Next point, a deepened appreciation of the beauties of nature. Classical literature is all about cities, towns, clubs, coffee houses, courts, nobility and their affairs, wars, and all that. But when we take up romantic literature, it is a pleasant experience. It is altogether a different experience because romantic writers had a deepened appreciation of the beauties of nature. What beauty, what wonders lay in the nature. So they turned their eyes towards the nature, to the countryside, in the forest. They sang songs, they praised, they expressed their awe and wonder when they wandered in the midst of the nature. Any poem written by Wordsworth and Keats, Shelley, they go on to illustrate this very fact. A general exaltation of emotion over reason. a general exaltation